The wind cut like blades as Samuel opened the door to his small wooden house, isolated in the heart of the wild forest of Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest village on Earth. The smoke escaping from the old wood stove mixed with the frozen air, forming thick clouds that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Outside, the world was white, silent, and unforgiving. The 71°C gave no respite, and any exposed part of the body burned as if it had touched fire. Samuel pulled his Yakutian hat up over his eyebrows and hugged his fur coat to his chest before taking his first step into the snow that crunched beneath his boots. 20 years ago, that icy patch of land had become his home. Far from civilization, 30 kilometers from the nearest village, he built with his own hands everything he needed to survive a house made of thick logs, insulated with layers of oak and old rope fibers, as per Yakutian tradition. Instead of glass, cellophane-covered windows tried to keep the heat inside, but the wind found its way through, always finds it, and so, even before sunrise, Samuel was already on the move. Inside, the heat from the stove was beginning to disappear, and the dogs huddled in the corners of the house looked up in silence, waiting. Samuel knew, without firewood, everything would freeze. The water, the food, the bodies. He hung the Yakutian knife on his waist and grabbed the makeshift sled before disappearing into the trees. The forest knew him, and he knew the forest. He knew where the trees were still good for cutting, where the ice was thickest, and where bears used to leave tracks. But tiredness was starting to take its toll. Each trip was slower than the last. The body felt it. His fingers throbbed even under his thick gloves. The beard would freeze in minutes, but stopping was not an option. That morning, as he was carrying the first logs, he heard the dry snap of a branch breaking not far away. He stopped, his heart racing. It could just be the cold breaking yet another tree, but it also couldn't be. Wolves usually approach silently, and, in that cold, any delay could be costly. He picked up the pace, dragging the sled, his eyes fixed on the way back. It was always like this. Every trip to the forest was a bet against the weather, against the cold, against luck itself. Back at the house, my hands shook as I revived the fire. The flames danced little by little, illuminating the wooden walls already dark with time. The dogs approached, relieved, and Samuel took a deep breath. Another day had begun in Yakutia. Another day had been won. Samuel leaned against the wall, holding a metal mug of warm water drawn from the ice of the lake. The steam rose slowly, dissipating into the cold air of the house. Outside, night was already falling, and the cold tightened like an invisible fist. But he was at peace. There was firewood, there was fire, and his dogs slept quietly by the stove. Back in Yakutia, this was the kind of victory that was celebrated in silence with slow breathing and closed eyes. So, what's winter like where you live? Comment your city here, and say if you could bear a night like this in Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest village on Earth. Samuel crouched down in front of the unlit stove, ran his hand carefully over the rough fur of the older dog, who was trembling silently, and felt the goosebumps rise through the layers of wool and skin. There was no time. He put on his thick boots, still damp from the previous day's snow, wrapped his face with a hand-dyed Yakutian scarf, and picked up the knife stuck in the wooden wall, the same one his father had left behind before leaving for the forest and never returning. When he opened the door, the darkness of the morning was still mixed with the smoke from his own lungs. The light did not come from the sky, but from the snow that reflected what little there was. The forest seemed to wait for him in silence. Each snow-laden tree seemed to bow under the weight of time. With each step, the snow sank to his knees, forcing Samuel to stop, breathe, and continue. The wooden sled creaked behind him, light on the way out, but promising for the return. His hands hurt even under the thick gloves, and the air seemed to cut the inside of his nose like tiny invisible needles. But the worst thing was the sound, or rather his absence. When there is absolute silence, any small noise sounds like a scream, a dry branch breaking, a breath among the trees, recent footprints at the edge of the path. Samuel stopped. It wasn't the first time he felt like he was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. He had already seen eyes among the bushes. He had already returned home with nothing because he decided to live another day. But now, it wasn't for him. It was for the dogs, for the flame that needed to be rekindled. Then it continued. He found 2 dry trees nearby, planted the axe, and began work. The sound of splitting wood seemed sacrilegious in that white silence. When he finally tied the trunks to the sled, His legs were already shaking, but he had done it. Upon returning, the sky began to lighten. The house was still standing, and that, in Yakutia, was already a form of victory. The wind increased in intensity, whipping stone-hard snowflakes in Samuel's face. The trees disappeared into the icy white mist, and the sound of the sled scraping the frozen ground became more and more distant. The weight of the trunk seemed to multiply with each meter. He stumbled, fell to his knees, his hands buried in the snow. He stayed like that for a few seconds, quiet, trying to gather the strength to get up. The sweat, trapped under the skin, began to cool, and when the sweat cools down in Yakutia, the body begins to fail. He felt the pang in his chest. It wasn't pain from exertion. It was the cold coming in. He looked at the invisible sky and felt time passing too quickly. If he stopped for another 2 minutes, he wouldn't come back. I knew that. But I also knew that leaving that firewood there meant going home empty-handed. And the dog's eyes expected more than that. He gathered what little was left, tied his arms to the sled, and dragged the weight with his bent body. The tears froze before flowing. His mouth popped when he tried to inhale. The path home seemed longer, steeper, as if the world were against him. But gradually, the wooden silhouette covered in ice appeared among the trees, like a lighthouse in the fog. The legs weakened, but they didn't stop. Arriving at the door, he left the sled, pulled the axe with the last strength he had, and began splitting the trunks right there, with his fingers already numb. One by one, he threw them into the house, and soon the fire crackled again, bringing them back to life. The dogs approached, lay down near the flame, in silence. Samuel sat on the wooden floor and watched the fire dance. It was still shaking, but it was there, once again. Another day won in Siberia. Yakutia does not forgive. Yakutia tests. And he resisted. The smell of bread spread throughout the house like a warm hug amidst the constant cold. Samuel broke the still hot dough into 3 pieces and placed one of them next to the stove, where the dogs were already watching in silence, waiting. The other he ate slowly, feeling each bite as if it were a rare gift. He kept the last one in a thick cloth, rolling it well before placing it inside the old wooden box outside, covered by snow. The cold of Yakutia worked better than any refrigerator. When we left, the sky already took on that dark blue tone typical of winter nights. The frozen branches crackled in the wind, and the forest seemed to sleep under a layer of eternal ice. But there, standing in the darkness, Samuel took a deep breath. Something inside him was different. The hair, the fire, the bread, small signs that even in Yakutia, sometimes life also leans in favor. He went back in, washed his hands with ice water, and turned on the kerosene lamp, whose flickering light drew shadows on the walls. He sat down next to the radio and turned the knob, more out of habit than out of hope. Static filled the room. But then, for a brief moment, he heard a distant voice, words in Russian, distorted, speaking of an approaching extreme cold front, even colder, more than usual. Samuel closed his eyes. There was no choice. I needed to reinforce the protection of the house, cover the gaps, prepare the dogs, ensure that the food would last. In Yakutia, the difference between 50 and 71 was not just a number. It was a fine line between resisting and being swallowed. He got up slowly, feeling his body sore from the journey, but his spirit was upright. He lit the fire once again, this time with 3 entire logs. He looked around. Everything was ready. The night would fall like an avalanche of silence and darkness, but inside there was warmth, there was life, and that, in that forgotten part of the world, was enough. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the subtle sound of the dogs breathing, curled up together at the foot of the bed. Samuel remained motionless, eyes open, staring at the wooden ceiling as if trying to see beyond it. Body heat began to slowly be lost to the environment, and even with thick skin, the cold still found gaps to enter. But he was already used to this type of visit. The cold in Yakutia doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives. Outside, the wind intensified, and the walls of the cabin groaned with the gusts. The shadows danced in the flickering light of the lamp, and Samuel allowed himself to remember. He remembered his mother's voice, who once taught him how to make tea with Yakutian roots to combat the cold in his chest. She remembered her little sister, the runs in the shallow snow, the laughter that echoed through the trees before everything disappeared. He remembered his father returning with frozen fish in his hands, and the fire lit in front of the old house. long before loneliness became part of the furniture. Now, all that was left was that little wooden house, his dogs, the stove, and the memory that insisted on surviving along with him. Outside, the cold continued to descend like a heavy curtain over the forest. Wolves howled in the distance, perhaps in response to the silence of the snow that covered everything. Samuel turned onto his side, hugging one of the reindeer hair pillows. His breathing was now slow, rhythmic, as if his body was finally finding rest. Life there was not made up of plans or the future. It was made up of late mornings, simple dinners, bread, and clean water. It was made of presence. In Yakutia, eternity is measured in days survived, and that night, another one had been conquered. No witnesses, no fuss, just the firmness of a heart that chose to continue beating even where the world seems to freeze. As the fire subsided and dawn took over the forest, Samuel fell asleep in silence, lulled by a cold that was already part of him. In the deep darkness of Yakutia, Siberia, the coldest village on Earth, he continued to resist, day after day, with the strength of someone who made the ice his home. So, what's winter like in your city? Comment below, tell us where you watch from, and share this story with someone who values courage, silence, and survival. If you feel the cold in your heart, like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter.